Guten Abend, sehr geehrter Herr Botschaftssekretär, sehr geehrte Frau Bezirksvorsteherin, freut mich, dass Sie gekommen sind, freut mich auch, dass Sie gekommen sind. Guten Abend. Ich möchte Sie im Namen des Wiener Wiesenthal-Instituts für Holocaust-Studien recht herzlich aus Anlass des Festvortrages von Professor Wulf Kansteiner im Zusammenhang mit unserer großen Jahreskonferenz, die Simon Wiesenthal-Konferenz 2014, begrüßen. I think most of you are more eloquent in English, so I will change into English and also would like to welcome you to the keynote address of Professor Kansteiner in connection with our Simon Wiesenthal Conference 2014 here in Vienna. Normally, I welcome you here on the occasion of a Simon Wiesenthal lecture, and the roof attic here in the Haus, Staasarchiv is the permanent venue of these lectures. Tonight, this very place, as part of the Federal Chancellery of the Republic of Austria, is more or less the country's power center, serves as the first venue of the Simon Wiesenthal conference for the keynote address of Professor Kansteiner. This very location, or the choice we made to have this location here for the Simon Wiesenthal lectures and the Simon Wiesenthal conference, could also be interpreted symbolically. Since the forced emigration and then the mass murder of the Austrian Jews for a long time was neglected in this country, was forced to the periphery of the Austrian public awareness of the recent past. When Simon Wiesenthal and his institute now come to the very center of the Austrian public administration, more or less in the house where across this courtyard the Federal Chancellor of the Republic of Austria resides, this is also a symbol, in a way, of the willingness of this country and its society to at least try to clarify the country's entanglement with the Nazis and of coming to terms with the criminal past, of posting the history of the Holocaust in the very center of public memory. With all the contradictions and all the problems this process even today is accompanied with or produces in this country. I do not intend to get into any kind of official opening now of our conference, since there will be time enough tomorrow and in the ORF Funkhaus in the Public Broadcasting Center of Vienna, and even then I hope I will not bother you too much with formalities. Therefore, I immediately would like to welcome and introduce now our distinguished speaker of the keynote address today, Professor Wulf Kansteiner, and I would like to introduce him very shortly. Professor Kansteiner is Associate Professor of European History at Binghamton University. This is a part of the New York State University network, as far as I understand. On leave this semester, he's currently Associate Professor of Memory Studies and Historical Theory at Aarhus University in Denmark. He studied at the Universitet Bochum and at UCLA for 10 years, as I just learned. He's a cultural intellectual historian of 20th century Europe with a focus on the representation and collective memory of World War II and the Holocaust in Germany. His special interest is mass media representations of these events, especially on television, as well as their impact on post-war historiography and philosophy. In addition, he pursues projects concerned with the theory and practice of historiography, historical culture, media history, and comparative memory studies, and is developing a kind of methodological critique on collective memory theories. He's also co-editor of the journal Memory Studies. His most recent or important publications are In Pursuit of German Memory, History, Television, and Politics After Auschwitz in 2006, The Politics of Memory in Post-War Europe, 2006, Historical Representation and Historical Truth, and finally in German, Den Holocaust erzählen, Historiographie zwischen wissenschaftlicher Empirie und narrativer Kreativität. And the title of tonight's presentation is Nazi Perpetrators on German Television, Before and After Holocaust, and evidently the word Holocaust has to be put not as we have it in our printed program, and I excuse for this error, because evidently the word Holocaust has to be put into quotation marks or at least printed in italics. Then it's understandable what Professor Kansteiner means. Professor Kansteiner, welcome in Vienna, and please take the floor.
Thank you very much for the kind words, for the introduction, for the invitation, for the opportunity to speak here, and thank you for attending tonight at the beginning of what I think is going to be a very interesting conference, because it offers us the opportunity to come to terms with a media event that has shaped our memories, has shaped the memories of many generations and many communities, and I think it's high time to look back and take note and maybe draw up a balance sheet of Holocaust memory. Of course, we will have the images and the television series as our focal point, but I think this is an opportunity to go far beyond that and think about the memory of the Holocaust that has been triggered, that has in many ways been created by that television series, and try to think about the limits of Holocaust culture, the limits that Holocaust culture might come up against in the present, in the future, and also the limits of Holocaust culture that we might perceive ourselves, things that might have to be changed. That's a tricky thing, but I think one of the realizations one should have whenever one deals and looks back at Holocaust culture is a realization of its fragility, of its extreme artificial construction, in a sense, of its fragmentary nature, of the possibility that it both could never have happened, perhaps, and that it might disappear. Holocaust memory seems to be extremely well institutionalized, but at the very same time, I think it is fragile, and we have to be aware of that fragility. That's an opportunity, maybe, but it's also a limitation, and we should think about that. And I will go into more details about that. So before I begin and show you images that you might know, images that have disappeared in the archives, and engage very specifically the question of the representation of the Nazi perpetrators in German television, I want to begin with a few general remarks to frame our conference, to frame our discussions, and perhaps to open up some questions that can be of interest in the coming days. So, Holocaust, the TV series, is of course at the beginning, and it is very difficult for us to imagine what could have happened, might have happened without that television series. Many things happened afterwards that were probably influenced, perhaps caused, definitely triggered by the TV series. Think, for example, about the rise of Holocaust historiography. There was no large-scale, professional, historical research about the Holocaust before the TV series. There were a few isolated historians, often ignored by the discipline, who pursued work in the archives, but there was not the kind of historiography that we have today. That is a phenomenon that started after the television event, the media event Holocaust. The same is true for the large-scale engagement in literary culture and in media culture. In my view, one of the most productive and one of the most interesting, and in some perhaps maybe also problematic, parameters and paradigms of thinking about Holocaust in an academic setting, the so-called trauma paradigm, the cultural trauma paradigm, has also developed after the media event Holocaust. So it is in many ways tied up to similar origins than the empirical work in Holocaust historiography. And of course, to be, so to speak, even closer, the variegated, the broad, the globally circulating Holocaust culture with the many institutions of Holocaust memory came into existence afterwards. Now, it's perhaps wrong to reduce all of this. It's definitely wrong. I would be a bad historian if I reduce all of these phenomena to one television series. That doesn't make any sense. Holocaust as a media event happened because there was a foundation for it. It happened in many ways because in material respects, in generational respects, in cultural respects, there was a foundation upon which that media event could take place. People were sensitized to the topic, they were ready for the topic, they were prepared for the framework, for the cultural type of intervention that the television series represented. Nevertheless, Holocaust is, for better or for worse, a game changer, as we would call it today. And as that we have to remember, and as that we have to study it, with its prehistory and, of course, also its effects afterwards. Now, what do I mean when I call Holocaust memory today fragile, which seems like a contradiction, because when we look around and we see what kind of collective memories exist in today's societies, then Holocaust memory seems to be one of the best prepared, one of the best institutionalized, one of the best that has a foundation and a future. But I think institutions of memory, as memory institutions, only as successful as they are in reaching an audience. We can easily imagine circumstances in which Holocaust institutions of Holocaust memory exist, but where they don't have the social cultural relevance that they have had and that they still have today. Why is that so? Because there are reservations about Holocaust memory in many quarters. There are intellectual reservations about it. If you look at some of the cutting-edge developments in history, in media studies, in other fields, then increasingly there are, for example, sociologists, historians who argue that the Holocaust is no longer an appropriate framework for the study of massive human rights violation. There's a significant number of people who, for very, very good reasons, argue that it makes a lot more sense to study human rights violation within the context of comparative genocide, within a context especially of colonial and post-colonial settings. And there are very good reasons for that. But in those frameworks, Holocaust history becomes one case among many. Maybe that's the kind of contextualization we need. Maybe not. But it's an important question to address, and it's a question that we have to address in our work as intellectuals and as experts in memory culture. Connected with that are reservations about Holocaust as a didactic tool. In the last years in Germany, some very serious researchers, some very serious representatives of memory institutions have raised questions about the way that we teach Holocaust history in schools, the way we teach it at memorial sites and in museums. They have argued, and these people are politically, without any doubt, perfectly above the fray, so to speak, they're perfectly acceptable. They have argued that the way we teach Holocaust history gives very little agency to the people we want to teach. In a sense, we are, so to speak, committing acts of discursive violence because we are presenting our student generations, our students in high schools, with very, very specific contents, and we give them very little time to choose their own approach to the topic. People have gone as far to argue that the didactics of human rights education has to not just focus on the catastrophes, it also has to focus on the successes. Now, if that comes from places like Germany, it does make me occasionally slightly nervous. But the arguments have to be taken seriously, because Holocaust memory, in the end, is not a purpose in and of itself. It has to serve a higher political goal, including, very explicitly, to help us imagine collective ways of belonging that allow us, our collectives, other collectives, to reduce human rights violations by ourselves, first and foremost, and by others. That is one of the benchmarks that Holocaust education, at least, has to live up to. And it might very well be, I think it's a legitimate question to ask, are there venues, are there contents, are there strategies that accomplish these goals better than Holocaust education has or might be able to do it in the future? I think these are important questions. We might want to come back to it later, perhaps tonight or in the coming days. And then there are elements intrinsic to Holocaust culture that seem to indicate that the way that we have crafted a successful Holocaust memory cannot continue into the future, because that Holocaust memory runs up against media developments, against cultural developments, against generational limits that make it very difficult to pursue Holocaust memory in the same way that we have done it in the past 3 decades. Two concrete examples for that. The first one, very obvious one, is the dying of the generation of the survivors. Very soon, we won't have survivors. And survivors played an absolutely decisive role as bridges between the past and the present in Holocaust education. Now, you might want to argue, because all of you here are media experts, that the survivors themselves might indeed be dying. But we have the images, we have the testimonies, we have vast collections of testimonials. The biggest, of course, is in Los Angeles in the Shoah Visual Foundation, 52,000 testimonies. 52,000 survivors have given their testimony there. If you wanted to watch those videotapes, you would need about 20 years if you watch 8 hours a day. So we have material, massive amounts of material. We have more material than for any other catastrophe in human life or human memory or history. But I would argue the figure of the survivor, the figure that is represented in the tapes, is not something that travels easily into the future, because the figure of the survivors, as it was constructed on television first and foremost, played a very important role in conveying a sense of co-presence to the audience. The audience could see itself as it was watching television in the same time frame as the survivors. They never met them maybe in person, but they could imagine themselves as being in principle able to talk to them. There was the idea powerfully conveyed by the media figure of the survivor that they share the same historical moment. And you cannot have that effect with old footage, because old footage is always dated. There is, as you know, no media aesthetics that can avoid its own historicization. So in that sense, somewhat ironically, an abundance of media material does not translate into our ability to replicate similar type of identifications and similar type of shuttling between past and present in the future. It simply doesn't work that way, I think. But there's another challenge, a much bigger challenge. Holocaust culture, for very good reasons, was always crafted against a real and imaginary other. The real and imaginary other of Holocaust culture were first and foremost those generations who did not want to engage with the history of the Holocaust. Those generations, especially in Germany, had no desire to, revisit German crimes for obvious reasons. So that's, so to speak, the first category of Holocaust deniers, if you want to call them that. And then, of course, Holocaust culture was always cast against the neo-Nazi, neo-fascist deniers of the Holocaust as well. So Holocaust always had built into itself the importance on insisting that it happened and insisting on it in the face of people who seriously questioned that. As a result of that, Holocaust culture has a very tough time of dealing with interactive culture, because we are now at that threshold. I'm convinced that the memory of the futures have to be sustained, have to be replicated, have to be popularized by way of the most popular media of the future. And I think the most popular media already now are interactive media. They're social media, and most important, they're media like video games. So in that sense, Holocaust culture is a product of linear media, of radio, of television, of film, of books. It is not a product of interactive media. And it's not poised, it's not positioned to transition very well from linear to interactive, in part because of the communicative front that I have outlined. That is, its very important insistence on disagreeing with any sorts of Holocaust denial. Why is that? Because interactive culture is, by definition, counterfactual. The moment you participate in a digital setting, in a digital reconstruction of Holocaust history, you have to imagine that, right? A complex digital world that allows people, players, so to speak, consumers, to immerse themselves into that history. The moment you have that, you transfer agency to the consumers and to the users, but you also raise the possibility of counterfactual cultural practices. And that is something that we, for very good reasons, are very nervous about. I mean, imagine, right? Imagine a very sophisticated video game that creates this world and is then being used by people to play counterfactual scenarios along the lines that the Holocaust never happened. Now that's at stake. That's at stake in digital interactivity. That's sooner or later, these scenarios will happen. I'm absolutely convinced that it will happen. The question is, when do they happen? For what purpose do they happen? And can we imagine didactic, political, cultural settings where we want them to happen and we want to be part of them? I think that's one of the challenges that we also have to come to terms with, and that many people in memory institutions have to come to terms with today. So that's my general attempt of framing what we're doing here. And now I want to transition into the material that you might be more interested in, that is the visual material of the representation of the perpetrators. And again, I think it's very important to immediately understand two things about German memory culture. I think German memory culture is the best we have, or I should be more precise, at some point, especially in my view in the 1980s, German memory culture was the most self-critical and self-reflexive culture that we know of. It was an accomplishment, a quite important accomplishment for the collective of perpetrators, at least one part of it in the West, to engage with its own crimes again and again and again, under very specific circumstances and for very specific reasons and with very specific limitations. So, having acknowledged that accomplishment, I think it's equally important, certainly for us, to realize its limitations. And one of the very severe limitations of German memory culture and its foremost medium of reflection, that is television, is its inability to come to terms with the perpetrators. Now, granted, that's the biggest moral challenge. That's the unprecedented challenge. There is no society in the history that has had a very, very successful, very self-critical engagement with its own perpetrators. It simply hasn't happened. So in that sense, the German efforts are exceptionally successful. But you can see time and again, when it comes to the representation of the perpetrators, there seem to be hurdles, there seem to be problems that cannot be overcome. And that's part of the story that I want to tell you today with some very concrete examples. I think it's important then again to realize that this challenge is very difficult. It might have been difficult for many people to imagine how to tell stories of victimhood and survival in 1945, in 46, in the post-war years, probably up to the 1960s. There was no framework for it. But the framework for telling stories of victimhood and survival was invented. That's part of what Holocaust has also accomplished. And today it is very easy to tell stories of victimhood and survival. There are many parts in the world where people replicate these stories with relative ease. We have not been as successful in telling self-critical stories about perpetrators. That's a challenge, I think, that still has to be faced. There are exceptions, there are some very positive examples, but in general, I think we have not succeeded yet, not to the same extent that we have managed to create empathy with the victims of history. So in that sense, I'm telling the story today of a failure, the story how the perpetrators time and again, even under the best of circumstances, even with the most serious commitment of very committed journalists and media executives, the perpetrators disappear from focus. They disappear outside of the primary focus of the programs. And they have only been very rarely the primary focus of these programs. That's what I mean by my title. That, on the one hand, the perpetrators are omnipresent. Hitler, to give you just one perpetrator, is omnipresent in the German media landscape, absolutely everywhere. And that starts already with the beginning of television in the 1960s. This is not by any means an invention of the 1970s or 80s. But at the very same time, a focused engagement on the perpetrators, not perpetrators as part of a different story, not perpetrators as part of a story about resistance, not perpetrators as part of a story of survival, not perpetrators as part of the story of World War II, but a specific narrative visual focus on the perpetrators, a direct, engaged, in-depth coverage. That is very rare. So, you know, my database, as some of you might know, is primarily the programs of Zweites Deutsches Fernsehen. That's what I have studied in depth. Although I can report that I have recently managed to get into the archives of some of the ARD stations as well. And I have some preliminary data that back up what I'm going to say about the ZDF. We can talk about some of the details afterwards. But, you know, my material is what ZDF has produced, has broadcast since '63. That's where I have my clips from. And in that, admittedly, fairly vast terrain, you know, 35 plus years of television, 40 years of television, there are really only a handful of programs that live up to the admittedly high standard of focusing squarely on the perpetrators. Programs that in the title, in the description, for the viewers very clearly acknowledge and announce that this is a program about Nazi perpetrators first and foremost. There's only a handful, depending on how you count it, about 25. Most of them have been broadcast, and I'm going now approximately up to the year 2000. Most of these programs have been broadcast in off primetime hours. There are very, very few programs that managed it into primetime. And I think if we for a moment move away again from our topic, that is the history of the Holocaust, then and pose this as a larger question, that I want to connect to some of the questions that I've raised earlier. Even in that sense, studying the history of the Holocaust can teach us that we still have to learn to tell perpetrator stories, period. They don't have to be Holocaust stories, but we don't yet have a framework for it. We don't yet have a self-critical framework. We seem to be very afraid, maybe for very good reasons, that we can't show perpetrators one-to-one. We cannot show them because we are afraid that we help to replicate them. You know, that might be a very legitimate fear, but it also limits our engagement, our self-critical engagement. Now, with these very long introduction, you have waited long, I'm going to give you some clips. The first one is from 1964, that is 1 year after ZDF started its broadcasting. It's actually a documentary that was co-produced between German and Polish television, so some of the images come from Polish television, and it's a very good example of the questions being raised, and also a very good example about the context within which perpetrators appear on television and how they also relatively quickly disappear. I'm not going chronologically. I'm trying to put programs together, sometimes by very different years, to focus on documentaries, focus on fiction, and try in that sense to give you a complete picture that, as I said, does not necessarily work chronologically. But we are beginning here in 1964.
Der ehemalige SS-Oberscharführer Josef Kleer kam nach Kriegsende mit seiner Familie aus Schlesien nach Braunschweig und fand eine Wohnung in der Kreuzstraße. Er änderte nicht einmal seinen Namen. Zunächst war er Tischler in einer Mühlenbaufirma, später fand er eine Stelle als Karosserieschreiner in einem großen Werk. Seine Arbeitskollegen erfuhren von seiner Vergangenheit erst, als er verhaftet wurde. Wenige Tage zuvor hatte ihn auf dem Werkshof eine Mitschülerin, die Arbeiterin Bertha Müske, wiedererkannt.
Ich kenne den Kleer aus meiner Heimatstadt und nach der Machtergreifung 1933, da hatte er dafür gesorgt, dass auch mein Bruder verhaftet wurde, weil sie im Arbeitersportverein war. Und nach 40 Jahren, da traf ich ihn bei Bissing und Sohn auf dem Hof wieder und haben auf den Kopf drauf gesagt, dass er bei der SS war. Da hat er gesagt, nein, es wäre sein Bruder Willi gewesen. Aber nach einer Weile gab er es doch zu, dass er es war. Und es war furchtbar, so einen Menschen noch einmal in die Augen zu gucken, wo er so viel verbrochen hat.
1945. Die beiden Kriminalsekretäre O und P erhalten den
What is so intriguing about this clip is that this clip is describing the situation within which most of Nazi perpetrators were brought to trial. The vast majority of people who ever stood trial and were sentenced were identified in this kind of haphazard way. They were recognized by former victims, or they were recognized by relatives or friends of former victims, and they were therefore then brought to the attention of the authorities and put on trial. Most of these trials were conducted in the post-war years, in the relative, after 1949, often, or beforehand by the Allies. But that's how the largest, by far the largest number of Nazi criminals were punished. What's also intriguing is that, of course, the perpetrator does show up here. One has the visual representation of the perpetrator, which is actually fairly rare. It is rare for a number of reasons, and some of them are legal reasons. As you will see in the next clip, this one is, I'm jumping ahead now, to 1982. Now, the first clip is at a time when there was no Holocaust consciousness. Holocaust, in that sense, as an event, did not exist. 1982 is, of course, at a time when Holocaust was a clearly established paradigm of interpretation, including attached to it, of course, the question of the uniqueness, exceptionality, and representability of the Holocaust. Attached to it, what we know very well, the focus on the survivors, and also, of course, what makes that paradigm a narrative paradigm, the type of contract with the viewers that combines the representation of atrocities to the representation of survival, and in that sense a happy end. That's a very important part of it. All that was, in that sense, developed. What makes this program so intriguing is that it was first and foremost broadcast on the occasion of the second broadcast of Holocaust, the TV series in Germany, in 1982 in the first channel and not in the third channel as it happened before in 1979. The second important part about this program is that it was crafted by one of the most critical journalists of German history of coming to terms with the past, Lea Roche, and that on her part, we find in her one of the most committed people in the public who is insisting time and again of the failure of coming to terms with the perpetrators specifically. And what's intriguing is that also she, of course, runs into very serious problems when it comes to representing the perpetrators. Here we will see.
Auftrag, die polnische Arbeiterin Malczyk, die beim Plündern erwischt worden war, zu erledigen. Die Erschießung spielte sich, laut Schwurgerichtsverhandlung von 1955, folgendermaßen ab. Der Angeklagte O. nahm seine Dienstpistole aus der rechten Westentasche und feuerte von hinten auf den Hinterkopf der Malczyk kurz hintereinander 2 Schüsse ab. Die Malczyk brach sofort, ohne noch ein Lebenszeichen von sich zu geben, tot zusammen.
Das Urteil des Schwurgerichts Würzburg wegen Totschlags. Erstens, das Verfahren wird eingestellt. Zweitens, die Staatskasse hat die gesamten Kosten des Verfahrens zu tragen.
P. sagte dann aus, er habe noch zu O. gesagt, die Polin sei schwanger. Nach dem Gesetz dürfen Schwangere überhaupt nicht hingerichtet werden. Er solle sie zur Wache zurückbringen und nach Würzburg verschuben. O. habe erwidert, das könne er nicht, denn er habe schon Bescheid gesagt, dass die Polin nicht mehr zurückkomme. Er gebe der Polin noch einen Schuss in den Bauch, dann sei das Kind auch tot.
Das Schwurgericht Würzburg befindet wörtlich, nach ihrer Stellung war den Angeklagten nicht zuzumuten, die Straftaten zu unterlassen. Die beiden Angeklagten haben sich in durchaus untergeordneten Stellungen befunden. Handelte es sich um subalterne Beamte, die gewohnt waren, Befehle möglichst genau und gewissenhaft auszuführen.
Mörder und dennoch frei. Weil ein Gesetz alle Straftaten während des Zusammenbruchs, laut Bundesgesetzblatt von Oktober 44 bis Juli 45, amnestierte, wenn nicht mehr als 3 Jahre Gefängnis zu erwarten waren. Und mehr war eben nicht zu erwarten. August 1982. Auch der frühere SS-Unterscharführer K. verlässt als freier Mann den Gerichtssaal, obwohl bewiesen war, dass er zumindest an der Ermordung eines Säuglings in Hamburger KZ Neuengamme beteiligt war. Die Rechtsprechung schützt heute auch die Persönlichkeitsrechte von NS-Tätern. Deshalb ist uns verwehrt, sie beim Namen zu nennen und kenntlich zu machen.
So here you can see the very banal limitations of that quickly then television executives run into. Even when you are most seriously committed to the process of engaging with the perpetrators and their crimes, you can't show them on television any longer unless you're dealing with one of the very, very few people who is found guilty. So in that sense, it becomes very, very difficult to engage it in a compelling visual fashion. What is lacking then is in the non-fiction context to bring the audience face to face, with the perpetrators. And that's a very important limitation, despite the fact that, of course, in another sense, in a narrative sense, the perpetrators are here clearly the focal point of attention, but they are that fairly rarely. What's also interesting about that production is what I showed you is exactly how it opened. This is how it was broadcast. It was uncut. It was actually up to the point of including all those, the orange footage that, of course, was broadcast just like that. You can imagine that what was most controversial about the program was the opening. That is the restaging of Nazi crimes. And also in this context, you can see that for perfectly understandable reasons, the faces of the actors are not represented. So you have at the very point, at the very center of the one program in my whole sample that it has the most exposure, it is prime time, that has a vast audience, that is done by a person who is committed to self-critical historical reflection like almost none other. After all, Leah Roche, as you know, is one of the two initiators of the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. That even under those circumstances, in the context of the rebroadcast of Holocaust, which has now been established as a classic, even under those circumstances, it is very tricky to engage with the perpetrators. So now a cut to raise the obvious question from that. What about fiction? In fiction, those limitations shouldn't exist, right? In fiction, you should be able to bring the audience face to face with the perpetrators. But it doesn't work that way. And here's an example from 1970. It's a program called The Confession, and you will immediately see how it is narratively framed, and you can immediately see how the perpetrators are disappearing. They're disappearing both as visual focus and often in that program also as narrative focus.
Ich möchte beichten.
Wann haben Sie das letzte Mal gebeichtet?
Das ist lange her.
Sprechen Sie.
Ich habe getötet.
Sagen Sie mir Näheres. Wann? Wen?
Im Krieg, im Osten. Wir mussten schießen.
Auf wen mussten Sie schießen?
Man hat uns gesagt, es seien Partisanen. Heckenschützen, will ich mal sagen. Kriminelle, aber...
Aber?
Es waren auch Frauen dabei. Mit Kindern. Kleinen Kindern. Es war furchtbar.
Warum kommen Sie heute zur Beichte, nach über 25 Jahren? Wenn es so furchtbar für Sie war, warum kommen Sie erst jetzt?
Ich muss mit jemand reden. Jetzt. Wo die Angst weg ist.
Welche Angst?
Vor dem Prozess. Ich muss es jemand sagen. Verstehen Sie? Sie haben mich nicht gekriegt.
Hören Sie, so geht das nicht. Ich mache Ihnen einen Vorschlag. Kommen Sie heute Abend, oder wenn Sie wollen, gleich jetzt zu mir ins Pfarrhaus. Wir müssen ausführlich darüber sprechen. Und ich glaube, in Ihrem Fall ist es besser für uns beide, wenn wir uns sehen.
As you can imagine, that conversation, of course, never takes place. They never see each other. So this is a television play that is an embodiment of the absent present. Of course, the perpetrators are the focal point of the narrative in many ways, but they're never shown. Why is that a problem? That's a problem because identification cannot be created. You know, without a clearly embodied presence of the perpetrators as normal people, you cannot build identification and you cannot break identification. So in that sense, this is very symptomatic for the strategies, for the conundrum, for the dilemmas that are very clearly faced by television executives in the 1970s, 80s, and onwards. There is one other TV play that also deals with the perpetrators in those years, and that has exactly the same construction principle. In that case, the narrative goes as follows. There's a very successful industrialist who dies, and in his last will and testament reveals that he was a Nazi criminal, and he wants to be buried under his real name and not his assumed name that he used to escape justice. So in that case as well, the person is not present any longer. It's all in the absence talked about. And as again, I want to emphasize, you know, you have to always, we all do that, we have to realize the options not taken. It's very clearly that the option was not taken. Oliver Storz, as you know, is a very, very successful television producer, television writer. And so these are the best people in German television. And they clearly perceive a limitation that they don't feel comfortable crossing. And as a result of that, the perpetrators kind of disappear, even in the very moment that the problem is being raised. There's another very obvious question then one could raise about the narrative. In this kind of setup, is as kind of the eerie suggestion that the only way that this problem can be addressed is when the perpetrators come forward, come, so to speak, on their own volition. And that's not true. You know, there were plenty of tools, some of them were being used in Ludwigsburg, among other places, to identify perpetrators. But this kind of television representation of it seems to indicate that the hands are tied, right? Like the priest. The priest cannot reveal, he cannot go after that. So to speak, society's hands are tied as well, which of course is not true. Okay, now a cut, again a jump to a different paradigm, but very close in years. The next program is a very, very exceptional production. It is today recognized as an absolute classic. It is recognized as one of the classic representations of a survivor on German television that fulfills all the definitions of the Holocaust paradigm, but happened earlier. And therefore, it's a very, very good example to show that there was a cultural foundation for Holocaust, the miniseries. It was not that the topic had not been addressed. It was not that survivors were not on German television. It's a rare occurrence, but it happened. This one, as I said, from 1972. It's a survivor who lives in Norway and now returns to Germany to have his health assessed because he has applied to additional support from the German state. And therefore the documentary is called Mendel Scheinfeld's Zweite Reise nach Deutschland, Mendel Scheinfeld's second trip to Germany. What emerges here very clearly is that once the media texts begin to focus on the survivors, they lose track of the perpetrators. And they do so for sometimes very, very compelling reasons. In these conversations, as we see clearly, the survivor can simply not talk about the perpetrators. A traumatized person cannot talk about the perpetrators, and that's perfectly acceptable. In other cases, one can also find an interesting pact between the German journalists who are traveling now around the world, and in the 1980s they do this, and interview survivors, and the survivors themselves, where the survivors feel, it's tangible often in those communications, where they feel, here's, so to speak, one of the good Germans. They are clearly taking risks by coming to interview survivors and bringing them back home virtually. And therefore the survivors choose to focus not on the perpetrators, the people who tortured them, but they kind of downplay that and focus instead on their own experience. It's perfectly understandable in this kind of communicative setting, but these things now lead again to a disappearance, to a sidelining of the survivors. And I want to show you this clip because it shows it in typical, very good fashion. And it is true for many documentaries that are then broadcast, as I said, especially in the 1980s.
Mendel Scheinfeld, 49 Jahre, Jude, geboren in Polen. Von Oslo, wo heute wohnt, fährt nach München. 1,5 Tage wird unterwegs sein. Es ist Mendel Scheinfelds zweite Reise nach Deutschland. Mendel Scheinfeld leidet unter Schlafstörungen, Angstträumen, Schwächeanfällen, Gleichgewichtsstörungen, Depressionen, Kopf- und Rückenschmerzen.
Und am schlimmsten ist, wenn sich die Leute hinstellen und mich anschauen, da geht es noch schlimmer. Da gehe ich lieber an irgendeine Ecke und naja, nach einer Zeit bin ich wieder einigermaßen klar. Denn wenn ich so eine Periode habe, da weiß ich überhaupt wegen nichts, da habe ich nur die schlechten Zeit, also wenn ich sagen darf, also die Konzentrationslagern und die Ghettos und die Dinge mit den schlechten Leuten, ich möchte sie nicht beim Namen nennen.
Das sehen Sie alles vor sich dann.
You saw that, right? I don't want to name their names. That's the key scene here, and that you find a equivalency of those moments in many representations of survivors. Many of you will know that Grabe made another documentary with Mendel Scheinfeld in the 1990s. So there's so to speak a sequel to this documentary. It's not quite as impressive as the first one, but it's also very important. Grabe is certainly one of the most serious, courageous documentary filmmaker in film and television in Germany at that time. So that's the situation. Then this kind of absent present, the kind of the lacune that is being created here for not necessarily always intentionally. It's a certain helplessness. There are clear objective limitations, as we have shown, but I'm convinced that it is in that kind of this absence, in the middle of, so to speak, the problem of coming to terms with the past, in the most important medium, in the most important years. That absence is one of the reasons for the success of the next paradigm of German remembrance, which I would argue does no longer have the same self-critical edge. And now, of course, I'm talking about the paradigm of Guido Knopp, which, as we all know, was produced by a large collective, and Knopp is just the head here. And we also know very well, you all do, that the paradigm is over. Not only because Guido Knopp retired recently, but also because the framework is not as successful any longer. But we also know that from the mid-1990s to about 2005, even later, it was everywhere. Prime time was dominated, and not just in Germany, in many other countries as well, by this type of engagement with history. And as I often do in these contexts, I want to emphasize what a tremendous accomplishment in terms of the modernization of the genre of the documentary was here, done in ZDF at the Lerchenberg. But it has very severe limitations, and one of them is that it cannot self-critically engage with the question of the perpetrators. Because now in this new paradigm, the only perpetrator is one Hitler and maybe a few other Nazis, and everybody else is more or less cast into another world, either clearly cast as victims, you will see that here, or is cast in some kind of neutral bystanding role where the question of involvement is not even raised. And for that, I'll give you now a couple of examples. Because we should not forget that, this is, the visual memory of these events is always generationally divided. So there's a whole generation of television consumers who have seen this. This is their reference point. They do not have another important reference point in terms of visual culture, in terms of television.
22. Juni 1941. Deutscher Überfall auf die Sowjetunion. In blinder Gefolgschaftstreue lässt sich die Wehrmacht zum Werkzeug von Hitlers Eroberungsdrang machen. Geblendet durch die schnellen Siege und die Massen von Gefangenen unterschätzen die Angreifer die Widerstandskraft der sowjetischen Verteidiger. Doch im Winter wird vor Moskau und vor Leningrad der deutsche Vormarsch gestoppt. Das Unternehmen Barbarossa scheitert. Nun gehen Deutsche reihenweise in Gefangenschaft. Hitlers Größenwahn bleibt ungebrochen.
Wir wissen aber eines schon heute: die bolschewistischen Massen, die den Deutschen und die verbündeten Soldaten in diesem Winter nicht zu besiegen vermochten, werden von uns in dem kommenden Sommer bis zur Vernichtung geschlagen sein.
Bis zur Vernichtung. Der Diktator will entweder Weltmacht oder Untergang. In diesem Jahr muss die Entscheidung fallen. Und so treibt er seine Wehrmacht in ein neues militärisches Abenteuer. Dabei rückt eine Stadt ins Blickfeld, deren Name sich für Millionen Menschen, Deutsche wie Russen, für immer mit Verzweiflung und mit Tod verbinden wird: Stalingrad.
Stalingrad, Mamajew-Hügel, Halle der Trauer und der Andacht. Der Krieg ist eine Katastrophe, ein Unglück und kein Heldenlied. Die Zeitzeugen in unserer Serie, die als Soldaten an vorderster Front kämpften, werden das deutlich machen. Und wir, die Nachkommen dieser Soldaten, wollen diesen Krieg auf unsere Weise betrachten. Es war mehr als ein Konflikt zwischen zwei Regierungen. Es war ein Kampf zweier Völker. Gerade das hat uns hier zusammengeführt, Guido, und lässt uns jetzt eine Sprache sprechen.
Ich denke, deshalb stehen wir beide hier in Stalingrad. Der Kampf um diese Stadt war wohl die blutigste und mörderischste Schlacht der Zeitgeschichte. Und noch heute ist der Name Stalingrad umstrittenes Symbol für opferreichen Widerstand, genauso wie für sinnloses Gemetzel. Militärisch überflüssig, aber psychologisch Wendepunkt des Zweiten Weltkriegs. Wie es dazu kam, das zeigen wir, die Russen und die Deutschen, wiederum gemeinsam und gemeinschaftlich.
So you can see, if you look at that clip from the end point, there's all the politically correct messages. This is 1991, and the ZDF was absolutely path-breaking in creating relationships to Russian and Eastern European television stations, and also entering their archives and bringing home the images that these archives yielded. It was often, as you know, one of the ways of selling the programs to advertise to the audience how many of the footage was new and exciting. And then you see the politically correct message of reconciliation, of overt pacifism. But you also could see beforehand the bizarre blending of aesthetic styles that to a large extent take their cue from Nazi propaganda material that is replicated, often unchanged replicated, and that is also then confirmed, for example, by way of the music, because the music is then orients itself more towards the Nazi propaganda material than any kind of other reference point. And you could also see very clearly that the German soldiers, like all the soldiers, are here cast in the role of victims. They are not perpetrators. They are all victims. That was the common denominator upon which Russians and Germans could agree. So that's one of the reasons why it's also there. But it also, again, makes it very easy to avoid the question of the German perpetrators. They disappear in that coverage. I'm going to, an example that this was, as I said, from 1991. That is the very beginning of it. And then it slowly takes off the paradigm in the 1990s. The first program in prime time is from 1997, and then it becomes a fixture of prime time for about 10 years. I will give you now what again, many of you will know this. This is a Holocaust from 2000, Holocaust with a K here. That was very controversial, that K in the title. And I think what is particularly important here is also increasingly the programs address not so much questions of history, that is causality, why. They address increasingly questions of feelings, how did it feel? And for that purpose, they become very, very imprecise, but very, very engaging as well for the audience.
Ich war eine von ihnen. Ich hatte das gleiche Blut in meinen Adern. Ich ging mit ihnen auf die gleiche Schule, mit Polen und Ukrainern. Wir waren wirklich Freunde, hatten Spaß, wir tanzten und sangen zusammen. Und plötzlich waren wir für sie keine Menschen mehr. Wir waren nur noch Juden.
Viele werden Zeuge. Einer spricht zum ersten Mal.
Muss so sein. Hätte ich viel früher machen müssen. Wenn ich das gleich gemeldet hätte, vielleicht wäre aufgeräumt worden, nicht?
Vielleicht 7, 8, 9 Meter weg. Ein Lanzer. Mit einer Maschinenpistole, so lässig im Arm. Und guckt gebannt nach unten. Und dann traf mich der Schock.
Dagda, Litauen, Juli 41.
Direkt unter mir war ein Bub. Und vielleicht 6 Jahren. Und der griff immer nach rechts. Ich nehme an, dass da sein Vater stand. Und dann nahm der Mann hinter ihm die Pistole, gab ihm einen Genickschuss. Und einen Fußtritt. Befördert ihn mit dem Fußtritt in die Grube. Und da war die Grenze bei mir erreicht. Und der kleine Junge begleitet mich heute noch.
You'd see that, again, that was all the information that the viewer received about these individuals. And I think you can see that all the eyewitnesses are treated the same way. So what is crafted here is almost a visual assumption of innocence. You know, it blends from the survivors to these others. And the others are not identified. Nobody asked the question, what were you doing? were you just watching? The question is never raised. Now, I come back to this point, but first, about these people. You probably caught that. It has been very well analyzed. Most successfully, I think, these scenes have been analyzed by Judith Keilbach. I don't think she's here now, but hopefully you'll see her tomorrow. She's on the program tomorrow morning. In her book, she shows how the first scene shows the German soldier who repeats one of the myths of one of the self-defensive myths of the Wehrmacht. It says, the speaker, the off-screen speaker says, some speak for the first time. And then he continues to say, I should have done it earlier. If I had done it, maybe, or he said, maybe it would have been cleaned up. That is, of course, tricky to analyze. It's a very short intervention, but it would fit perfectly into the myth that many people in the field apparently entertain, that if they had spoken and brought this to the attention of the leadership, the army leadership, Hitler maybe, that something would have happened. Nobody intervenes. Nobody asks this. Nobody asks for clarification what he means. What is important here is that he cries. That makes him the focal point of attention. That makes this clip so important. And you can also see the difference between the survivors and these German soldiers. The survivors have done this before. They are relatively composed. The soldiers, indeed, speak often for the first time in the camera, and they are very moved. As a result, they are also very moving. So they become the point of emotional gravity of these programs. But their participation, their role, potentially as perpetrators, is never raised. Now, in the case of the first soldier, that leads to this strange apologetic discourse. In the case of the second soldier, it's a catastrophe, because Karl-Heinz Drossel is very famous among experts, among historians. He's one of the righteous. Afterwards, he saved a number of Jews at great risk for his own safety. So he drew important consequences from that experience and then steps out of the Nazi frame of mind. The program doesn't mention that. It doesn't work with us. It doesn't highlight the fact that there were options. Apparently, it's not interested in that. The paradigm is not interested in that. I don't want to say the people behind it are not interested in that. So in that sense, here very clearly, you are, so to speak, in the center of the question of perpetration. You are in the center of the events of the Holocaust. This program was designed very carefully, very ambitious, and the risks were clear. The ZDF here enlisted the help of the best experts that historiography has to offer. Chris Browning was one of the advisors on this production. So in terms of facts, this is checked and double-checked. But it doesn't change the fact that in terms of the emotional tapestry that is being created here, it's a highly problematic production that does not engage with the question of the perpetrators. It brackets it out completely. It treats these people as neutral, so to speak, venues of reflection. The next example, I want to do this quickly now. Here I want to highlight the aesthetic integration, the stunningly successful way that in these products of the ZDF Department for Contemporary History, they managed to create an aesthetically seamless product from things that are very different. Original footage, animation, eyewitness testimony. These different elements are in restaged scenes, very important. These different elements are integrated in such a way and digitally remastered that they create a seamless product. And that's what this purpose was. The purpose was to create a feeling of immersion. And that's how people also certainly consumed it. They, so to speak, entered the world, this world of kind of Hitlerland, that was so enticingly dealing with all kinds of exceptional situations, love, death, murder. I mean, one, challenging situation after another. But it does so in an aesthetic framework that especially the experienced viewer can very nicely handle and partake. And the focal point, again, are the feelings that are created. It's not the why that plays any role, not the causality. It's the feelings that are conveyed in this process of immersion.
Die meisten liegen im europäischen Teil der Sowjetunion, dort, wo der Krieg am meisten zerstört hat. Für viele Gefangene heißt es aber, ab nach Sibirien. Ein gewaltiger Kosmos aus 5000 Lagern, fast so groß wie Stalins Archipel Gulag. Oft Wochen dauern die Transporte zu den Lagern. Die Gefangenen sind eingepfercht in Güterwaggons. Schon jetzt ist es mit der Kameradschaft oft vorbei.
Es war Ende Februar, Anfang März, das ist eine barbarische Kälte noch und in einem Zug. Und die erfrieren praktisch vor ihren Augen. Aber denken Sie es, einer nimmt da einen Mantel und deckt die zu, der lässt die erfrieren. Wir haben die erfrieren lassen.
Keiner weiß, wohin die Reise geht.
I think you could see, I think, very well this kind of, the atmosphere that is being created, the cold blue color that does everything, and the importance of the restaged scenes. Historians have always criticized this paradigm and said, why are you restaging the scenes? Well, for the crafting of the atmosphere, the restaged scenes, the kind of, the train, they're extremely important for it. It's also beautiful here how, the equivalencies are created between the POW camps in the Soviet Union and the Archipel Gulag, right? Very nicely transitions from one to the other. The program is dedicated to the prisoners of war, the German prisoners of war. It mentions, of course, the Soviet prisoners of war that are murdered by the Nazis and especially by the military, but they are mentioned. Then, in terms of acting it, in terms of conveying the feelings, it focuses exclusively on the German soldiers. And you can here see also this very, very effective use of the testimonials, right? These clips, these like 20 seconds, 25 seconds, very well, very nicely, very excellent lighting that creates this kind of authenticity. They are old. They fit, so to speak, the time frame. And if you look at that language, it was, a television person couldn't ask for better language. The only thing better is people crying. But other than that, this was perfect because he switched from the past tense to the present tense and therefore, did the shuttling service. And he switched from the third person to the first person, we, from both of these switches are there. So it creates a fantastic a mingling of past and present. Not for the purpose of analyzing, but for the purpose of conveying the feeling. See, it alludes to these questions of how they're treating each other. This is the victims of the German soldiers don't play a role here at all. It's how they victimized each other that becomes, so to speak, the possible problem here. So in that sense, I think it's quite clear. I think it's very clear that this paradigm did two things. It did allow an engagement with history. And I don't want to argue that these programs didn't have self-critical or self-reflexive effects. I don't know that. I'm convinced that some people watched these programs and engaged in critical senses with the past that they otherwise would never have done. That certainly happened. And I might even argue that some of the effects of these programs that it allowed for an audience to engage with realms of memory that were systematically written out of the official culture. And in many ways, they're part of the official culture. In terms of the commentary, they are always politically correct. They always acknowledge German responsibility. But in terms of the images, they are acting out something very different. They're acting out feelings of pride, even, about Nazism, feelings of mourning about power lost. So, the audience had this ambivalence, had different ways of engaging. And one of them was to be a politically correct citizen of the Federal Republic, separate and unified, and also to play a little bit Nazi, to play how it felt like, how these exceptional situations felt like. And again, I want to be very careful. I don't know the net result of these very ambivalent programs. They are problematic, but I don't know how much damage they have done. I doubt that they have done that much damage, actually. You also could see here, of course, the liberal transfer of Holocaust iconography, right? From the topic of the Holocaust to the topic of German POWs. The barbed wire, the trains, all the iconography is there, and it's now the German soldiers that are victims. The program is from 2002. That's precisely when German, society was once again engaging in questions of German victimization in World War II. So this is nothing extraordinary, but it accomplishes that indulgence in very, very efficient ways. Now at the end, if I still have time to do that, and I still can, rely on your patience, I have one last clip that completely changes things. But I think for me it's very important to show it. I think it's important to realize in these discussions that all the programs we have seen engage with the problem of Nazism on the level of memory, from the vantage point of memory, not from the vantage point of history. I think we have to realize that, because that seems to be the only thing that people are able to do, what they think they can do responsibly. What's the difference? On the level of history, if you engage with Nazi crimes and Nazi perpetrators on the level of history, you have to show them. You have to show their deeds. And you don't necessarily have a frame. You don't have an explicit memory frame as a safety device. Right? If you stay on the level of history, you recreate their world, their worldview, their actions, their demise, you name it. But you don't have between the crimes and the present and the viewers a memory frame. Now, all the things that you've seen so far have very explicitly a memory frame. It's Guido Knopp standing there, for example, sometimes saying, this is why we do it. In one way or another, memory is introduced. Lea Roche said very clearly, this is what happened, this is why, what happens afterwards. It's always done from the perspective, and it is narratively realized from the perspective of the present. It does not, it doesn't dare to simulate history nakedly, directly, for the viewers. It always puts in between the realm of memory. And I think that's very important to recognize here, that this is one of the limitations. It's understandable, it makes perfect sense. And it might have to be one of the limitations. We can argue about that. But I think it's very important to realize that. And it has a risk involved in it. This memory that is so important, that we are in many ways recognizing, even celebrating perhaps, this self-critical memory, also runs the risk of verging into strange territory. The very same way that the attempts to focus on the perpetrators for all kinds of reasons go off track, for the very same reason, the emphasis on memory can take on a life of its own. And then it's the memory accomplishments that are the primary narrative focus, and no longer the crimes, and no longer the suffering. Because if the Holocaust paradigm did one thing in Germany, then it brought to the attention of the vast majority of the population the importance of the suffering that they had created. That's the accomplishment, and it's a very, very important accomplishment. When you focus too much on memory, even that disappears. And I want to show you an example here that is, in some sense, it is more violent than what you have seen so far. And it's more, for me, it's more upsetting even than what we have seen so far, because it does precisely that. It celebrates memory at the expense now of the survivors. From 1995, an afternoon program has not received massive amounts of attention, probably made with the best of intentions, but completely derailed.
Wie wichtig ist es für Sie, dass Fabian regelmäßig zu Ihnen kommt?
No, das ist für mich sehr nötig. Das ist sehr nötig und Ich bin sehr froh, dass jeden Tag kommt. Er ist wirklich sehr gewissenhaft und sehr gut.
Denken Sie manchmal daran, dass er ein junger Deutscher ist?
Ja, aber ich mache keinen Unterschied.
Sie sind von Deutschen, auch von jungen Deutschen, gequält worden in Auschwitz. Und heute ist Fabian hier.
Auch von jungen Deutschen, aber er kann doch nicht dafür, nicht wahr? Er hat keine Schuld daran, selbstverständlich.
Das Putzen, diese ganz praktische Arbeit, hilft mir oft, mit den schrecklichen Erzählungen der Einsamkeit und der Hoffnungslosigkeit der Geschichte dieser alten Menschen fertig zu werden, sagt Fabian. Aber oft bleibt er auch alleine mit all dem Unfassbaren, was ihm die alten Holocaust-Überlebenden in Prag erzählen. Ein russischer Soldat hat dieses Foto gemacht. Die gebeugte Hedwiga Pechanowa bei der Befreiung in Auschwitz an ihrem 30. Geburtstag. Die KZ-Nummer 74.901 ist das äußere Zeichen für das, was ihr Leben für immer verändert hat.
Es ist in mir, sondern ich hatte bei der Heydrich-Jagd hier habe ich tragisch die Eltern verloren. Beide Eltern und 52 Verwandten. Also jetzt stehe ich ganz allein in der Welt.
Ist es da besonders wichtig, dass Fabian jeden Tag zu Ihnen kommt?
Ja, es ist wirklich sehr wichtig.
Was haben Sie für eine Beziehung zu ihm? Wie würden Sie das beschreiben?
Ich merke ganz freundlich.
Wenn der Krieg und die Verfolgung, die Nazizeit nicht gewesen wäre, würde vielleicht ein Enkel, ein eigener Enkel zu Ihnen kommen. Ist der Fabian so?
Ja. No. Ja, es ist so, wie Sie sagen.
Was für eine Art Enkel ist er? Ist er ein guter Enkel?
Guter.
As I said, probably with the best of intentions, but that's violence. So it's clear that you lose very easily track of the focus point, of the focal point. So if your narrative focus point, your focal point is now the accomplishments of German youth for the process of coming to terms with the past, then the survivors become tools to highlight these accomplishments, and they're no longer the focus, let alone the perpetrators. They completely disappear. And that is one facet. I think it's a very, very important facet of the last turns of the very complicated field that is German memory. It's clear that there was a script. There was a script, there was a narrative program, and that was ruthlessly implemented. And that script wanted to hear keine Schuld, no response, no guilt, no responsibility. That's what it was all about, to have the survivor say these things, and then, in that process, put her into extreme, very, very awkward situations. That is one of the risks of memory. Memory is, in that sense, is the best we have for purposes of self-reflexivity, but it's also, I think, a very risky undertaking. Because memory is always cast from the illusion of discontinuity. It has to be by definition. Memory is always, the memory as it is crafted here is always a memory that is on the side of the right the correct historical consciousness. And in many ways, we know that that's an illusion. And that illusion, you would have to give up that illusion when you do not have the realm of memory any longer as a narrative layer in the representation of Nazi history. That's, I think, one of the reasons why it's so difficult to have, for example, engaging fiction about the perpetrators. Now, we're here tomorrow, of course, about one of the examples that, or one of the following days, I forgot the program now, we will talk about unsere Mütter, unsere Väter, Generation War, as it's called in English. But very briefly, the program tries to fill that gap. It really does. Then I remember I was in a podium discussions with people from the ZDF in 2013, and we discussed many of these issues. It was a very lively discussion, a very open discussion, and I was impressed to what extent the people inside the television stations read our criticism. That was very impressive. So it was a long, hours and hours of dialogue. And one of the things they said is, this program will change it. This program, we took, so to speak, many of the criticism to heart, and we tried to correct it. And they did. In many ways, Unsere Mutter, unsere Väter tries precisely that, build identification and break identification, precisely one of the things that I have been arguing for many years. Now, of course, as you know, we've seen it all, it falls into lots of traps. The most important is the generation trap. All these people born around 1920, very young, socialized in National Socialism, they are too young to have political responsibility, and nevertheless, despite the fact that they are all socialized in the Third Reich, they don't seem to have any enthusiasm for Nazism. This is completely implausible. I mean, of course it's possible. You can find 5 people who are precisely like that. But again, the challenge is to show with how much dedication and enthusiasm German youth and German middle-aged people and German old people went to the task of organizing mass murder and condoning it. Until we have done that, the absent presence is remaining. You have to engage with that challenge, the challenge of showing that perfectly normal people like us, in many ways, did precisely that. So, that's fiction. I can design it. It's not that I cannot define the benchmark that I have in mind. What I not know is if in the last consequence, is it really responsible to do it? Do we really want that kind of simulation? Could I, as a television producer, argue that's what I want to do? A perfectly plausible, a perfectly attractive simulation of the complexity and the normality and the enthusiasm for genocide of these very normal people. I don't know, but it is an unfulfilled lacune in the middle of our memory culture. And that challenge will be even heightened if we go, so to speak, into the next world, that is, into the digital interactive world, where people then, so to speak, play Nazi, play perpetrator, play victim. How is that supposed to happen? I can see it as a media product. I can describe it. But the question is this a responsible way to go? So as my final thought, again, a question, not an argument. For all the reasons I've also mentioned in the introduction, it might very well be that we also need other contents for the reflection about human rights abuses. It might very well be that we have to learn from the paradigm to go to other representations and other themes of historical self-reflection. Now, that doesn't have to be exclusively. By no means I would argue we have to shift exclusively, but I can imagine, for example, one topic that seems to be absolutely front and center in all European societies, and we don't seem to be doing a good job in reflecting about it. That is the question of migration. We talk about it constantly, but we don't seem to have a good handle on it. And one thing that is missing from the discourse, as far as I can tell, is precisely the question of perpetration. Perpetration in terms of causality, where does the problem come from? But also perpetration, agency, in terms of our responsibility as societies. How are we dealing with refugees? How can we respond appropriately? How are we perpetrators in making their lives miserable? Because many European societies are, in this case, very, very, very active. And we have all seen the images of political agency in these cases that is maybe sometimes accidental, maybe sometimes intentional. But here, it shows again that we don't yet have a register to tell to ourselves stories about our own responsibility for very, very serious problems in the past and the present. Thank you.
Thank you. What I would suggest for the questions, ich wechsle jetzt auch ins Deutsche. Wenn es jemandem leichter fällt, auf Deutsch eine Frage zu stellen, ist das kein Problem. Herr Professor Kansteiner spricht Deutsch.
Ja, das
but
tut
it's also he will answer in English or German.
Yeah.
But whatever language is, I mean, German or English, I open the floor.
Well, my name is Ursula Stenzel, and I happen to be the governess of the 1st District. That's not why I'm here, but I'm here because of a personal memory of my parents and my sister, and because I'm, of course, very interested in the culture of memory. I follow many of these programs. Of course, I read a lot, and I'm of a very big historic interest here. So, what interests me and what I just saw recently, which was very impressive, was the documentation of the Himmler Tagebücher. The Himmler, yes? So, there you have a perpetrator as a normal person in his correspondence with his wife and his daughter. So, I mean, it just interests me, what do you think about it? Of course, it was not new to me, yeah, that these people were Spießbürger, as we call them in Germany, and very normal, in fact, yeah. That is one thing. And then after that, you had a documentation in the Austrian TV, which I also joined, of course not in the prime time, very late, okay, but I couldn't switch off. So I followed the documentation about the SS with testimonials of people who were in the theater, so to speak, in the Russian theater and so on. And there was one who seemed to be really, how to say, also emotionally suffering by what he has seen. Not necessarily what he has done, but what he has seen. And then there was another one who really transmitted the impression that in a way he was a normal officer. He was very well trained. It was an elite troop. So there were different categories of SS, of course, one for the field and so. And he really said something, and this shocked me. First of all, he was good looking. He was well dressed. He was not gaga, you know, he was not senile, yeah. And he said, you know, we were very good, but our problem was our commanders were not good. The commanders were not well trained, not intelligent enough, really. So, on the one hand, you had really a concentration on a perpetrator who was obviously, beside of the crime he was doing all the time, he was working on this, yes, like Eichmann and so on. And on the other hand, you had two testimonials. One had a good, I would say, a good effect in saying he really suffered from this memory of being a testimonial of crimes, in shootings, things like that, in Lithuania or somewhere. And the other one who just, felt sorry, more or less, that was transported. He felt sorry that the commanders were idiots, so to speak. So it's just not a question, but perhaps it shows what you characterize. What do you think about this documentation?
Yes.
And so on.
Yeah. No, it's indeed very important, and in that sense, I want to emphasize that my time of engagement, of course, is 1990s, late 1990s. That's where I have the data and all the data. But I think it's clear that things are moving towards the question of perpetration afterwards, and there are a number of productions that do that, but they do it in a different setting, and they do it with different results. I mean, I think one of the results is that in the media historical timing was very specific in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s, because there was this opportunity to reach vast audiences before the fragmentation of the television market. And that's what we have now. So many of the products that you are referring are vastly superior to the products of earlier years, but they do not have the social resonance that these kinds of programs would have had if they had been produced for prime time, let's say, in 1970 or 1980s. I think that's one of the important limitations. And then, what is somewhat ironic is that some of the very best programs, intellectually some of the best programs, some of the most thought-provoking programs, some of the programs that create, that produce for viewers this full ambivalence of those situations, the normality and the abnormality in both it simultaneously, what they do not provide, precisely because these people who make these documentaries are very aware of the aesthetic language of their infamous colleague, they are undercutting processes often of identification. They're slowing things down, they're letting them talk, they are putting in layers of distanciation again, and that's all perfectly fine. That's an individual artistic choice. It's a very important one. But as a result, what these programs often do not have is precisely this immersive quality that is, after all, in this context often was a problem, but it is also a fabulous opportunity. So I think in a sense you need that type of immersive quality in order to have those possibilities of reaching large primetime audiences. It doesn't work otherwise. So you have a highbrow, I would say, genre of documentary that is fantastic. It's extremely well made, and it addresses the topic of perpetration, but it doesn't address it in a way that is really that's pulling people in and going under the skin, so to speak, as these programs do. So these are the limitations. But the gaps have been realized. I mean, we have been arguing these things for a long time. The tragedy is, it's too late. You can't repeat. I mean, that's one of the tragedies of Austrian memory too. Yes. Yeah, it's one of the tragedies of Austrian memory, right? I mean, in Austria, the beginning of self-reflexive memory is the Waldheim affair, and it was those 10 years. The last 10 years were extremely important because you lost a whole generation of media users, and that was important when national audiences were still created. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, there are alternatives, and there are many people dedicated to this job of telling it. But they're also telling it at a time when these media are losing traction. They're losing traction as they're no longer defining. They're no longer the definitive type of media engagement. We are already in a situation of massive remediation and overlapping media situations. So in that sense, they unfortunately don't have those possibilities any longer. They don't even have the emotional, I think it's very important to realize, for example, that Holocaust had the impact it had because it came at the time it did. Holocaust, the miniseries, very important factor for its success, for the authenticity it created. Authenticity is always, authenticity is nothing objective. Authenticity is the relationship between expectations and realizations. And it had this kind of effect of authenticity because it was one of the first media events that in Germany people really received in color. Color had been introduced some years earlier, but it was only in the few years before Holocaust that the German media market was really saturated with color. So this relatively fast-cut, very attractive product drew people in as had not happened before.
Dann bevor das Eis bricht, vielleicht. Also ich glaube, ich bin jetzt, I'm sorry, I have to do that in German because my English is not sufficient for kind of coming up with my argument. Ich glaube, zu Ende haben Sie es, glaube ich bin mir nicht sicher, ob die Zeit dieser Fernsehproduktionen, wie Sie jetzt gesagt haben, in Österreich zum Beispiel vorbei ist. Also wir haben einen ganzen Fernsehkanal inzwischen, Österreich 3, der sozusagen die ganze Soße runterbringt, jeden Tag. Also es gibt entweder Mozart oder Hitler, das ist so die große Auswahl. Und das finde ich jetzt hochinteressant, das ist genau dasselbe. Aber was bei Ihrem Argumenten mir jetzt so eingefallen ist, Sie spielen immer dauernd aus Gefühle gegen das Warum, Memory gegen History. Und das Entscheidende, also die Frage für mich wäre irgendwie, was am Ende das Argument war, dass letztendlich der Täter nicht benennbar ist durch die Erzählung, habe ich den Eindruck gehabt. Also, und das fand ich ja irgendwie für mich, weil ich immer gesagt habe, es gibt gewisse, oder sage immer, es gibt ganz gewisse Sachen, die wir Historiker nicht erzählen können, die irgendwo in den Bereich der Kunst, in den Bereich der Literatur kommen und sagen, und hier, was ich jetzt für mich so spannend gefunden habe oder interessant oder widersprüchlich gefunden habe, ist, dass Sie ja das Gegenteil behaupten. Christoph Browning erzählt ja die Geschichte der Täter. Warum schafft es sozusagen diese gesamten, dessen alles bewusst sind, warum schaffen Sie es trotzdem nicht, diese Ebene reinzubringen? Sie sind ja irgendwie gegenläufig, gegen die allgemeine Entwicklung, würde ich sagen, diese ganzen Filme, so wie Sie es beschreiben. Es wird ja immer schlimmer, habe ich den Eindruck gehabt. Also, am Anfang geht es ja noch irgendwie mit der Lea Roche, das schluckt man noch runter und dann kommt dieser Guido Knopp und bei uns halt Hugo Portisch. Ja. Und ich meine, dass es hört nicht auf, sondern eben auch durch die sozialen Medien geht das ja noch weiter. Es erwartet uns noch etwas Schlimmeres.
Yeah, I think we first of all we should be careful that we realize that this is an ambivalent product. These ambivalent products that allow for a number of different reasons. The thing you mentioned perfectly appropriately before is the specialization of history. We all know it. You know, the History Channel in the US was the first one, and these models have been replicated. And you have a massive amount of material, but this material does not create media events. It creates a subgenre, a very successful subgenre that is just successful enough to be viable, so that the investment is worthwhile, but it doesn't create a kind of discussion. And that's precisely one of the things I was alluding to at the beginning. The memory culture, you know, all the institutions of memory, if it's a museum or a television station, or you name it, without an engagement with the audience and without an intense engagement with the audience is pretty, you know, useless. I don't see these routine broadcasting in cable channels any longer as intensive experiences. That might happen occasionally. There are always new generations who are coming into the situation of having to come to terms with the past. But we don't seem to have indication that this is triggering communication. After all, the learning process triggered by Holocaust didn't happen when you watched it. It happened in the communication afterwards, especially in the families and also in society. You know, it's what happens afterwards in terms of communication, in terms of self-reflection that is important. And if you know, today's viewers are so routinely tuned to this that it doesn't capture us any longer. In that sense, we all have a media biography, the medium has a history, and we all are no longer, you know, if we are old enough, none of us is where we were as a media consumer in the 1970s. In that sense, you know, these things can't have the same impact. But, you know, a very important question that you ask, why these limitations that have, you know, in some senses been overcome. But why at the time? I think that's the key question. I think we have to realize, I've always argued for many years that I really wanted to see Ordinary Men, Christopher Browning's book, as a fictional television program. That almost does precisely what I always have argued. And of course people are aware of that. Of course these questions are raised. But I think we also have to realize another limitation of television. It's the best we had in the 70s and 80s, but it always had severe limitations as an institution, and I think they are unavoidable. And one of them is television, public television, is a didactic tool in part, but is also very clearly a tool that produces a common denominator. What can be produced in television is in some ways a consensus. an aesthetic political consensus, and that has limitations. And it's very tricky to escape that consensus. If you know the production processes of television, you know how many loops a program has to jump through before it's finally produced. So in a process of self-censorship and in a process of corporate adjustments, you come to certain things that are deemed possible and feasible and responsible, and other things are ruled out. That's the best way I can explain it, you know, in terms of the institutional setting. But it's true. I mean, if we think of literature, I think one of the very interesting reference points here has to be, for example, Jonathan Littell's The Kindly Ones. It's a very uneven book, and as a literary accomplishment, I have serious doubts about it. But here, in the realm of literature, somebody has done it, has pulled out all the stops and recreated, from a perspective of empathy, the world of the perpetrators. So in a sense, again, I'm always transferring that into a visual medium with all the kind of immersive qualities that this medium has, in principle at least.
Yeah. I was just wondering, I mean, is not one of the problems the fact that we want to see the psychological side of the perpetrator, so we seem to be fascinated with the question, why? Why did he do that? And I guess TV gives a lot of space for this kind of question, but it's almost irrelevant, because what is more important, almost I would say, is how does someone become a perpetrator? So it's more on the historical side than maybe the memory side, and I think maybe we miss somehow this face-to-face with the perpetrator, because we try to find a place where we could identify, oh, it could be me, in the same situation I could have done but we are not in the same situation, so we cannot spend our time recreating this kind of alternate history of what I could have done if I had been there. And so I think when you suggest, for instance, that, okay, that would be very interesting to see the book of Christopher Browning turned into a media format, a visual media format. So maybe here we would be exactly at the moment of how, more than the why. And, well, just to finish on that, I mean, because you see, for instance, in Cambodia, you have a lot of work that is done on perpetrators. And you have a lot of questions around the why, but I mean, that goes nowhere. I mean, why, you know, they all have reasons, but how is much more interesting for what is happening right now in the Cambodian society. So I was just wondering if at some point in the 70s and 80s, this was not completely missed by the people who were making programs.
I think you're casting the how actually as a why question. You know, if you refer by how to the question of the setting, you know, the setting in which the person moves into the role of the perpetrator, maybe step by step, maybe suddenly. So in that sense, you know, describing and capturing that, to me, that's part of engaging with the question of causality. I think you are hoping to capture in this kind of reflections about the technicality. I'm aware of some other documentaries on the topic, and you're absolutely right. They deal with a how on the level of minutia. You know, on the level of the very everyday life. How did, so to speak, perpetration happen? And I think it's a very productive approach. I would argue that is completely compatible with a historiographical point of view, because that's precisely, in a sense, what Chris Browning does. He tries to understand the social psychology of perpetrators, and it's one of the most important realms of reflection that we have, and one of the most interesting developments in the last 10 years in academic work about perpetrators. But this is precisely a question of the everyday history of the causes, of the social psychological causes of perpetration. And it's very important. But as an intellectual question, always the challenge is, how do you translate that into a gripping, entertaining piece of fiction? And probably it has to be fiction. I think that's I do agree with many of the arguments that TV producers bring forward and say there are certain things that have to be there in order to engage a mass audience and even get to that point. And one of them is to engage precisely in identification, to build up identifications, and to engage in questions of alternate history. in a sense. I think all these engagements about the past is in a sense a counterfactual history. It always has this kind of, if it is engaging, if it's truly drawing people in as people with their personalities, then in some ways they put themselves into the situation temporarily. That's how it works, in one way or another. You can call it identification, you could call it projection. There are different psychological frameworks you can use for that. But nevertheless, there is, so to speak, a certain crossing, a certain imagining of the past being present. And I think that has to be an ingredient. And many of the highly sophisticated intellectual reflections, even in documentaries that we have, do not provide this, purposefully do not provide this. And in that sense, they're not so much about the how. But when I talk about how, I talk about the feelings. I talk about the feelings of how would it feel like? How does it feel to suffer? How does it feel to use violence? How does it feel to have power? How does it feel to lose power? That's not so much what these visual engagements are about, these minutiae, these everyday histories. But I think they have to be. Because I think in the end, if memory studies and memory representations of perpetrators has an important thing to teach us, then it's about us, our aspects, our elements, our potential to be perpetrator. And I think that's being mobilized here. It's tricky. It's a risky engagement, but I think it's a very important one. In that sense, the questions of identification and immersion is the right way to go. What I'm missing in all of this is not the tremendous accomplishment to have done it, to take the audience and bring it there. What I'm missing is to get them out in a reflexive fashion, in an organized fashion, in a way that triggers learning processes. In that sense, I'm always upset about the opportunities lost. So my answer to this is never to say, don't do it, don't immerse, don't identify, don't seduce, don't manipulate, so to speak. I wouldn't judge it that way. Do it. But then take people somewhere else once you have done that. We cannot go below that. We cannot pretend as if it didn't happen.
At the end of your talk, you mentioned that the makers of Unsere Väter, Unsere Mütter, unsere Väter, were very self-aware or were aware of the historical scholarship on the topic, on the questions they are dealing with. And so I'm wondering if you found sources in the archives of the ZDF for maybe earlier television productions that also point out that the makers of earlier television shows were aware of the historical scholarship at their time. For example, letters from producers or of writers to each other. And so my question leads to the topic of the reciprocity or reciprocal relations of historical scholarship and television, because I think that there are always relations, and that they kind of mirror each other in a certain way.
I think you're absolutely right. I don't think it makes any sense to cast the relationship between professional historiography in academia or outside and professional, after all, engagement with history, because that's what history television is. These are highly professional people. It doesn't make any sense to cast that relationship in the sense that the historians are right and the media experts are wrong. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And you're absolutely right that there's large amounts of communication, large amounts of back and forth. Now you see, the archives are very, very uneven, and especially as you might know, for the first decades of public television, if you have a production file or not completely depends on the whims of the producers inside of the Redakteure. Some of them took their files, some of them never made files, they never kept files. Some of them took them with them when they retired, and others actually gave them to the historical archives inside the station. And then you find a very clear people very aware. In fact, the first generation of history-producing television professionals were very academic. That's one of the reasons why their productions were so boring, because they always asked the professional historian's question. You know, television, it took television as a medium several decades to come into its own. Television, you know, the institution of television and the people behind it and the people inside it, it took them several decades to learn how to tell things visually, because they all came from a discursive background. They all were historians, academics, journalists, writers, and so on. And so it took a long time. So they're very aware. They are very tuned into historical discourses. What they often also find frustrating in their own work, that they can no longer engage with questions in a certain way. They have to learn another language, and they have to do it quickly on the spot. But it's very intriguing to show these give and takes. It goes, by the way, the other way. What's also very interesting is to see when historians are asked to be expert advisors for high-profile programs, and that's often the case. And you can find very interesting exchanges. What often happens in these exchanges, however, is that the historians, especially in the 1990s and afterwards, they have retained for themselves what I would call, you know, kind of a visual illiteracy. So they're looking at the scripts and they're checking them very carefully, and they give them their imprint to the best of their knowledge. But they're completely unaware of the visuality and the different messages that are being created here. They have nothing to do, you know, with the historical accuracy of some of the facts or not. But again, it's a very interesting thing to study. It's an intense relationship, it's a close relationship, and it's one that is full of misunderstandings as well. And deserves to be studied, by the way, you know.
Thank you. A question that kind of takes a lead from a point that you made in the first part of your paper and repeated in some of the answers. That basically, there's a missed opportunity in German television in fully critically and self-critically come to terms with the perpetrators and the act of perpetration. And the question is, do you think it's something that has to do with, the very general question is, why do you think that is the case? Is it something that has to do with Germany and Holocaust perpetration? Is it something that has to do with the Holocaust and the kind of the particularly extreme nature of the event? Or is it something that has to do primarily with the medium? And you mentioned the fact that you seem to acknowledge the fact that there are set of things that, for a number of reasons, there are some limits that come with the medium of television. Or is it something that has to do with because you said, like, we have not been as successful. And I understand if it's we as Germans or we as, say, Western culture, society. Or another way of phrasing the question, do you know of any non-German TV products that address the issue critically and self-critically in a way that German television didn't manage to do? Because that would be an interesting point, I guess.
That's a very interesting question. One of the points of departure always is, I do think, I'm convinced that this studying this visual culture and this large body of work that we have, it does yield one of the most actively self-reflexive, self-critical visual cultures that we have. You know, again, that's my point of departure. I don't want us to lose sight of that. Look, this is so important because the German model is now the European model. And as the official European model, this is how we are supposed to act. The EU central administrations are very clear about this. You know, it's the self-reflexivity that is, so to speak, accomplished in Germany is the one that Europe as a whole should follow. Now, that's a very misguided idea because self-reflexivity has to begin with the self. It has to begin the question of what is ourselves? Where are our commitments? And I think in many ways in Europe today, the commitments are still very much regional, national ones, despite the fact we sometimes want it differently. You know, self-reflexive memory culture asks you to go where it hurts in terms of your collective sense of belonging. That's why it always goes off into other territories, because it is a difficult process to do. Now, why? I don't think it has happened. I'm not aware of any example where I can point to and say, this society, this collective has done it better. I can highlight what I find the shortcomings. I've done that today. I used all my time for that. But I cannot point you anywhere else and say, I can argue theoretically how I think the so to speak, that black hole can be filled. But what I become increasingly skeptical about, and also, where I think one has to realize lots of limitations, is that it is very difficult, and it is a moral conundrum to do that. How far do you want to go to make the world of the perpetrators attractive, enticing, intriguing, entertaining? How far can you go? Now, I understand what's behind it. I understand why they're veering off course. They jump the perpetrators and then they go someplace else. I understand what's behind it, because there is, at the end, look, a few decades after 1945, there has to be at some point the feeling, aren't we ending up on the wrong side in recreating something and making this maybe very appealing, at the same time that you're dealing with all kinds of, former Nazis and new present Nazis. So I realize the political limitations, but nevertheless, it's a lost opportunity. I think we would know a lot more if this had happened, and maybe we can still do it. But what I don't want to be understood as going backwards and saying easily, should have done this and that cut. Yeah, I can point out, I can give you exactly every program, I can take it apart, and this cut now is highly fine problematic, you should have gone there instead. But what I think is very important, that we also have to recreate, as we write the story, the important media history, we have to go to the archives and see what has been communicated and how people worked. They really worked on this. And we have to put it into its contexts. And we have to certainly allow for the possibility that it was certainly perceived as the responsible way to do it, and it might have been the responsible way to do it. This is a counter. As often in these things, historians don't like to recognize that explicitly, but as often in these things, we are basing our narrative of the media history on counterfactuals. So in that sense, there is no proof. We don't know it, and we can't do it anymore. We can't go back. So I think there are lots of reasons, the institutions, the political, but they're also clearly very honest. There is opportunism, there's self-censorship, there's all kinds of things, but there's also a very clear ethical decision being made. This is how far I think I can go, and I don't want to go further. For truly a sense of responsibility, and not just because it would have ended people's career, which it might have done.
Okay, thank you. I think I will dismiss now the audience, because we have three very intensive days ahead of us.
Yes, they have to sleep.
Yep. Thank you for coming. I hope you are ready for further discussions the next 3 days. We start tomorrow at 9:45 at the Austrian Broadcasting Center. I think you all have maps in your folder where you can find how to get there. See you tomorrow in the morning. Thank you for coming. Have a nice evening. Thank you.